Hi everyone, it's Trish Triumpho Sullivan here with a lecture on sculpture. So earlier we talked about, earlier we talked about sculpture and that it has mass and it takes up space, just like us. So it also has kind of a tactile quality that we can perceive. So let's talk about the different types of sculpture. We'll get this going so you can see the background there. There we go. So freestanding is meant to be seen from all sides. And it's hard to really deal with that with just a photograph. Even a video is only going to show us one view and one light in that one moment, right? And so it's going to give pretty limited experience of a sculpture. So really sculptures are meant to be seen in person. This one behind us is one by Alexander Calder. It's called Obus. And Calder also does some movable sculptures we'll talk about later in this lecture. And this one, he coined a term called stabile as to differentiate it from his ones that move. But you can see that people often interact with sculpture. We talked about it in class with the Claus Oldenburg sculpture, the Hat in 3 Stages of Landing, that the artist actually likes to have people interact with his sculptures. He's into it. So it's something that often outdoor sculptors, the audience does interact with it, and it's pretty obvious. This little girl in the background here doesn't need to be told that she's allowed to interact with the sculpture. She's going to experience it firsthand, no problem. So if it's not a freestanding sculpture that you can walk around in 3 dimensions and see it from all sides, it's normally what we call a relief sculpture. And so we'll take a look at these different terms here really quick. So this is sculpture. There's freestanding. There's relief, and then there's bas relief, and it's spelled B-A-S, but it's pronounced bas. So bas relief sculpture. So the one we're looking at right now is a freestanding sculpture. Okay, there's nothing, it doesn't have anything behind it that needs for support. This other type that we're talking about is relief, and it's one type that does not project very much from the background, is called bas relief, right? And it's spelled B-A-S. So coins are a good example of bas relief. This one is from the year 415, and it's of Apollo. So, 415 BCE, which means before current era. And for something so small, it has a really strong presence. This is a one of the very first examples of bas relief that we can see today. Another example here is of bas relief is from the temple of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. And so this is a low relief. This is bas relief, and you can see that it's pretty detailed, but nothing is sticking out very far. It's very similar to the coin in that there's nothing that protrudes very far from the surface. So even though there's some texture there, you can see that there's a little bit of 3-dimensionality in it. It does not project far from the surface, and that's called bas relief sculpture. Right. So this is another example here. There's another type of sculpture that projects from a background, and it's called high relief. So this example by Robert Longo is called the Corporate Wars, Wall of Influence, and really has a sense of movement and turmoil. These types of sculptures that are high relief, often more than 50% of the sculpture projects away from the surface, and there's often quite a bit of undercutting on it. And so there's basically several methods used to, and here we go with high relief, in case you want to know how it's spelled. We've got high relief, right, as opposed to bas relief, right? And those are both types of relief sculptures. So there are really several different methods used to construct sculptures, and these are the methods. I'll put them up here for you as I'm talking. So we have modeling, casting, carving, constructing, and assemblage or assembling. So we've got these different types, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of or methods to do sculpting. So the first three are probably the most common traditionally over many years. So let's talk about them. Oh, and there's also two main types of creating sculpture as well. There's additive and subtractive, and we'll talk about the difference between additive and subtractive. And basically, really, it just means what it says. One, you're adding stuff to; the other, you're subtracting stuff away. So you're either adding or taking away. So let's talk about modeling. So modeling is usually more manipulative. So we consider it an additive process. So it's usually materials could be clay or wax or even plaster. And let's take a look at something that was done with modeling. Here we go. So the ball player here, as you can, and you may or may not be able to see on the screen here because it is just a smaller screen. But the ball player here, if you're close up, you can actually see the impressions of fingerprints on it. And in this sculpture, the body volume, the natural gesture, and the costume detail are clearly defined. The Maya were expert sculptors who at one time occupied parts of Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. So all the materials we talked about, wax, clay, and plaster, are pretty soft and pliable. So they're easy to work with. But because they are soft and pliable, when you're making something large, they might need what's called an armature. And here, I forgot I wrote this down. So we got additive and subtractive, right? And there's an armature. So you can see how that's spelled, armature. Okay. So they're pretty pliable, but they may need what's called an armature, right? And that's a support system or framework, kind of like our skeleton or, say, the framing inside of a building. It's there to hold it all together. So let's see. We'll put this one up. So this work is a self-portrait by Robert Arneson, and it's called California Artist. It was created using clay, and it also used an armature because it is so large. In fact, it's life-size. And the sheer weight of the clay would have probably collapsed it without that interior support, without that armature. So this artist was making a comment on a critic's observation, because there was someone who actually said some pretty derisive things, basically that, Californians and their art are spiritually and culturally bankrupt. And so this guy, he's a little offended by that, but he wanted to do like a sculpture to reply, but with a bit of a sense of humor as well. So he created this piece with empty eye holes, kind of like an airhead, like we have that stereotype, of people in California being kind of like hippie and cannabis users and maybe a little airheaded. And so he used the empty eye holes to kind of give that impression. He has himself kind of dressed like an aging hippie. And you can see there's cannabis leaves here on the side. And that's a little bit of a nod to the culture, the California culture. And then he also has bricks, and that was kind of a nod towards the craftsman the craft of brick making, which clay is used to make bricks as well. So he was kind of making a statement about California and himself as an artist inside California. And so this is a life-size sculpture. It's 68 inches tall, so it's pretty big. And so without an armature to hold it up, as an internal skeleton or support, it would not have. It's too big to hold up on its own. The clay is pretty sturdy, but not quite that sturdy. So another type of method of making a sculpture is called casting. And casting is a rather more complicated process, and it requires several steps. First, there has to be a mold, or it's often called an investment. And here's casting. We wrote it down for you. Right? It's also can be called substitution, right, or replacement. But casting, I think we might be familiar. Some of you guys might be familiar with that. So a mold or an investment, and we'll say mold because that kind of makes sense to most people, is made from the original work, which is usually the original work is usually clay or wax, right? So that's easily molded with your fingers, and then usually this investment, this cast, is made with plaster, and then the original work, once the cast is around it, then the original work is removed. Whether if it's wax, it's melted out. If it's clay, it's usually flushed out with water. And once the original work is removed from the cast, from the mold, then a liquid metal such as bronze is poured in. And when it's hardened, the mold is removed and you have the finished sculpture. So this here behind us is an example of, by Scott Chamberlain, is an example of a sculpture made with a mold. Okay, so some castings has reusable molds, right? So more than one sculpture can be made. That's why there's a whole bunch, well, maybe not a whole bunch, but there's about 15 casts of the Thinker, the famous sculpture by Rodin, where the guy's kind of sitting there with his thinking posture there. And we have one in San Francisco. So if you want to go see a bronze cast, go check out the Palace of Legion of Honor, where there's quite a few bronze Rodin sculptures. And those are, but believe it or not, from Spreckles money, the Spreckles sugar family. So they were doing some stuff there. So some casting has reusable molds, so you can make more than one. And others, such as lost wax, it destroys the mold, so only one sculpture can be made. Now, believe it or not, Hartnell used to actually have a bronze casting foundry. And when I was a student years ago, I actually took bronze casting classes, so I got to experience how this worked firsthand, and had a couple of bronze sculptures that I had made at Hartnell, which is pretty exciting stuff. So lost wax is often used for jewelry as well, which are little miniature sculptures, and the finished product, say the sculpture, can either be solid or hollow, depending on the method that's used for the casting. Creating a large piece of sculpture such as this one, and I'm going to hold this up because it's not in the book. I mean, it's not in this slide presentation I'm giving you, so you can see this. So this one is in our book, or I think it's in your copy of the book anyway, and it's called Man Pointing. And we looked at it earlier in the semester, and you can see that it's a pretty big sculpture. It looks small in the book, but it's 70 inches tall. So it's a large piece, and the same kind of thing is like with the Thinker, which is a very larger than life-size piece. It's extremely complicated, and sometimes the casting needs to be done in several parts because it's too big to do in just one casting. So they would make several different casts and then put them together after they're cast. So big bronze sculptures, say in parks and big monuments, like city monument kind of sculptures, are usually done at a foundry. By professionals, not by the artist. So the artist just creates the original work, either say in clay or wax, and then gives that to the foundry to be cast. And depending on the type of mold that they use, it can either be a one-time cast, so they only make one copy of it, and it's an original, one of a kind, or they can have a reusable mold where they can make more than one casting. So new materials for casting are things like plastics and polyvinyl resin, like what was used on this self-portrait sculpture by Charles Ray. It can be made to look really lifelike, like real skin. It looks real, and the artist actually made himself taller in this because he could. Who wouldn't want to be taller if they could do that? Well, maybe someone who's too tall, huh? So let me show you another work that's done with casting. And this one is called Tailgate. And it's made with an armature and canvas, paint, and Bondo. Yet it looks hyper real. Both works kind of poke fun at the line between real and fake. And, we value realism in art and often gauge the talents of artists by how real their art appears. Large sculptures made with materials such as polyvinyl or epoxy resin, and we'll look at this one here, are often created in smaller molds and then put together to make the finished piece, just like we talked about with bronze. So this is making a joke about realism in art. This artist created a mold from an actual water tower and used these new materials, we put it in quotes, these new materials to make it look like the water was holding its shape after the wooden tower was gone. And it's kind of an interesting look. If you can see it there, you'll see that there's, it's in the big city, and you've got these water towers on top of tall buildings in order to have the water pressure needed. And it's a kind of a whimsical poke at that technology. The artist has made a water tower that's just out of water. So the next type method we're going to talk about is carving. Carving is a method that's subtractive. Now we talked about casting as usually being additive, right? Because or modeling is being additive. And when people are making a cast of something, the artist has definitely modeled it before that. So modeling is an additive method, right? And carving is a subtractive method. That means the artist takes away material, it takes the material off of the piece to create the finished work. And materials include wood and stone. So that's the kind of things that you might use with carving. It is the least forgiving of all the methods because artists can't fix a mistake. If you take too much off, well, too bad. You're going to have a different looking sculpture. Michelangelo, he liked to carve in marble. And you can even see the marks of his chisel on this work. This is called unfinished. This work is unfinished. It's called Awakening Slave. Michelangelo said he could look at a chunk of marble and see the sculpture inside wanting to be set free. So it's kind of a cool thought that he had of being able to see something inside just a plain block of marble. Marble is pretty soft and easily carved with a chisel, so it can be done by hand. And it can be polished with like sandpaper or a light abrasive for a very smooth surface, something that looks really creamy, almost like people's skin. And it has always been the historical choice for Western public art. So ever since the Greeks and Roman times, marble has been a main choice. However, modern times now, we have, a lot of pollution, we've got acid rain, and that damages marble, so it's not really good to be used outdoors anymore. Granite is a really hard stone. There we go. And not easily carved with intricate detail. It's not something you can easily do. It's often used for gravestones. In fact, our panther at Hartnell College is made out of granite, if that helps to give you an idea. So it's really hard. You can't scratch into it easily with tools or anything. That's why it's resisted any kind of graffiti or vandalism, because you have to almost have power tools to make it work. So it's really hard. It's not easily carved with any kind of detail. Limestone and sandstone are softer. They're sedentary stone, and it can take intricate detail and polishing to a high gloss. So that was traditionally used in some of the Asian cultures. And another material used in Asian cultures is jade. However, jade is very hard and brittle. It's easily broken. So it's a medium that's really only good for small sculptures. So you'll often see jade pieces from Asian artists, and they're fairly small. They're usually under, say, 12 inches. They're not very big because they are so delicate. Schist, which is similar to slate, and slate is like blackboard material, right? The black stone was what was used by the ancient Egyptians, and the Olmecs of ancient Mexico liked basalt. Okay, and this is a example of basalt. It's a coarse-grained rock that is very hard and difficult to carve. This example is from about 12 to 10 centuries BCE, before current era, right? So we're talking, let's see, 10, like 12,000 years ago, if that gives you an idea. So a long, long time ago, this was carved. This is from Mexico. It's 5 feet tall and weighs about 3 tons. Even though the sculptor did an excellent job on the facial expression, the hardness of the stone made it difficult to do more shaping, and it still kind of retains that boulder feel, like that kind of shape, that it's still a boulder. So let's go on here. So wood carving. Wood carving is obviously much easier than carving in stone, and most sculptors prefer walnut or cypress as the wood for their strength and ease of working it. This one is called Mother and Child. It's carved from walnut, and it's abstracted. It's kind of an abstracted composition. It's suggesting maybe some anguish. The repeated shapes, and you can see there's some repeated shapes there. These angular shapes kind of frame the sculpture. And there's these concave and convex forms that have a really pleasing flow. And the solidness is broken up by that opening between the chin and the elbow. It looks really warm and touchable, which was one of the assets of using wood as a medium, is it feels warmer. Stone feels cold, right? Wood feels warm. So that's one of the pros, is that it has a very touchable feel to it. The cons of wood are that big hunks of wood dry out at different rates. So the outer layers dry faster than the inner layers, and that can cause cracking and splitting in a sculpture as it dries over time. So this problem was solved many centuries ago by the Chinese. And the Chinese, who have always excelled at wood carving, by using chunks of wood, smaller chunks of wood, right, and then fitting them together in a technique called joined block construction. So once the piece is put together, it is then hollowed out. So they actually carve out the inside of it so it's hollow. And that's to prevent the uneven drying of the wood. In this example, this is Bodhisattva Guanyin, is finished with paint, right? And it's really greatly detailed and lightweight. Basically, only an expert would be able to see where the wood pieces are joined. So if you look at it, you can see it's very, very intricate, very delicate. And while most major sculpture works were made using modeling or carving or casting, only in the last century did the process of assembling, called constructions, become popular. And that was pretty much with the invention of welding. We'll take a look there. In 1895. And a Spanish artist, Julio Gonzalez, became the first to pioneer welding as a form of sculpture. He had learned the skill in an automobile factory, of all places, and then he helped Picasso construct some metal sculptures. And all this time, Gonzalez is basically a painter. Like he knows Picasso is a painter, and he hasn't really put together the idea of sculpting himself. But he spent about 30 years fairly unsuccessfully as a painter. Then he tried his hand at sculpting. Picasso kind of gave him this idea that maybe he should try it, and it was actually a great success. This work behind me here is called Maternity. It's an abstract work. It's kind of playful and fun, and it does remind one a bit of Picasso's work, his abstracted works. So this one here, the same artist, Julio Gonzalez, is called La Montserrat, and it's representational one. So this, as opposed to this one, which is abstracted, this is representational. Now that we can tell it's a person. And it's taking inspiration from a holy mountain, a symbol of the Spanish resistance to the Nazi fascism and Franco's rise. And I don't know if you know, but World War II became a time when not only was Germany fascist, Italy was with Mussolini, and Franco came to power in Spain. Franco stayed in power in Spain until the 1970s, so he was there for a long time. Let's go on to another artist here. We'll take a look at Deborah Butterfield, and she's used found scrap metal to create her sculptures. Like the cave painting in Sister Wendy's history, okay, the artist has captured the feeling of a horse and the irony of using rusty old car parts and stuff from the junkyard to create an abstracted horsepower, so to speak, is not lost on the viewer. So some artists assemble found materials in a way that familiar items, are reimagined in a new way, like this one. This is called Bull's Head by Pablo Picasso. Now, we can see that it's made out of a bicycle seat and handlebars, old rusty bicycle seat and handlebars. Yet Picasso has invited us to participate in his vision by allowing us to see the origins of the parts reimagined as a bull. The bull is a strong symbol in Spain and dates to prehistoric times. So this is a real fun one, and you can see, and he actually says, he talks about when he did this, that he was looking at a junk pile of a bunch of old rusted parts, and when he saw the bicycle handlebars and the bicycle seat, it suddenly hit him that it looked like a bull's head. So he grabbed them and made a sculpture out of them, which is kind of cool. It's an innovative way. So he's kind of invited us to enjoy the process with him. Juxtaposition of real objects in an assemblage can bring on powerful new meanings that the objects separately wouldn't inspire. This piece is called "You See the Hut, Yet You Ask, Where Shall I Go Find Shelter?" Was inspired by recent events in Africa, but also by a line in an Afrobeat artist song, Kuti song, where the line says, "Tell the man with a gun that the people who teach our people fear render the whole country defenseless." So in this, there's a crutch, a rifle, and a tripod. and he's making this comment with not only music, but violence and the genocide of people. So it's something that we know has been going on in Africa for some time, with a lot of civil war and a lot of fighting and stuff. So the next, we'll talk about kinetic sculptures. Here we go. So kinetic sculpture is sculpture that moves, and the first sculpture that we saw was done by Alexander Calder, and when was called a stabile. Well, this was, Calder was one of the first to embrace moving sculptures, and kinetic sculptures are also known as mobiles, right? We see small ones sold, like you can use in your home, something you can hang up on in your room. Excuse me. And that mobiles was a term coined by Marcel Duchamp in 1914. Calder's work focuses not on mass, but rather on negative space around the shapes that he has there, how they move and interact in the random air currents. So this piece is untitled, and similar ones can be seen at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco. They have a pretty good exhibition area of Calder's work. Mixed media sculpture is exactly what it sounds like. So let's look at some mixed media. So it's exactly what it sounds like. The artist uses a variety of materials and techniques to create a work of art. So it's mixed media, right? They're using more than one medium, and they're mixing them up. So rather than having a big long list of different materials that were used, they just say that it's mixed media. Okay, so sometimes the choice of materials has a distinct cultural or symbolic meaning. In this work, it's called Borrowing Your Enemy's Arrows. The artist was inspired by an ancient Chinese war parable in which a crafty general dared his enemy to shoot at his boats as they floated by. And when the enemy obliged enthusiastically, the arrows helped the heavy boats to float higher in the water and for them to escape faster, basically. Let's look at another one here. So this tense, lurking figure is called Grim Boy, is a creation of artist Laura Schiniger, and has a rather feminist message. Her work resembles dressmaker mannequins. I'd say dressmaker mannequins from hell, maybe. They're a little freaky looking. And she uses chains and fur and fabric over a wooden armature, which we know what that is. And she evokes a sense of dread instead of the traditional woman's role of creating, say, beautiful clothing or doing homemaking roles. Let's look at this one now, too. So Nam June Pak creates humorous works, such as this internet dweller, commenting on our obsession with virtual worlds. And our final type of sculpture that we'll talk about today is installation. So an installation usually takes over a large space. And I'm sorry that I forgot to turn off the phone, so the phone's going to ring for a sec here in the background. And so it usually takes over a large space for the artist to create an environment. So environment is an experience where the viewer can actually be inside, say, of the sculpture. So usually the artist transforms a space with symbolic objects to create a comment on contemporary culture, such as this work by Katie Noland. And it's entitled "This Piece Doesn't Have a Title Yet." It's a bunch of beer cans faced by scaffolding, including the American flag. And that gives the viewer a clue to the meaning of this installation: nationalism, consumption, sports, even construction, all very American things. and perhaps a comment on the tendency of overconsumption. You can see that there's some repetition of colors here. If you look at it, notice the beer cans have the same color as the American flag. So there's a continuity in it, even though there's a lot of stuff going on. And this is a fun one. This old power plant in London is the space dedicated to a large installation for the museum. This installation here behind me is called the Weather Project. The artist used bright lights to make a sun, okay, because it's obviously it's not a real sun, and covered the ceiling with mirrors so that all this really beautiful yellow glow was reflected over the entire space, giving it a real warm glow. And to add to this indoor environment, he had fans blow clouds, we'll put quotes there, clouds of mist from melting dry ice to create a kind of indoor weather phenomenon. So you actually kind of would actually rain inside this giant building, which is kind of cool. So it's pretty cool, right? So those are the different kinds of sculpture. And I want to thank you very much for joining me today. And we will see you next time in class.